There is a moment, you will know it when it arrives, when a person who has given you everything simply stops. No slammed door, no final speech, no tears thrown like knives across the room, just silence. A silence so complete that it rearranges the furniture of your life without ever touching it. And you will spend years, trying to understand why that silence hurt more than every scream that came before it. I am going to tell you why. And by the end of what I have to say to you tonight, you will never again mistake the quiet ones for the weak ones. Let me begin where all true things begin. In the dark, there is a kind of person the world has learned to feed on without ever noticing it is feeding. This person absorbs the moods of a room before a single word is spoken. This person apologizes for wounds that were not their fault, carries the unspoken grief of others as though it were luggage they had personally packed, and mistakes their own bottomless capacity to understand for a debt they must keep paying forever to everyone without end. We call this person an empath, but that word is too small, too modern, too clinical for what I actually mean. What I mean is this: there exists among us a rare psychic type whose nervous system was built like an open door in a house full of strangers. Everyone walks through, almost no one wipes their feet. For years, sometimes decades, this person believes their gift is a debt. They believe that because they can feel what others feel, they are obligated to fix what others break. They believe their sensitivity is not a rare and dangerous power, but an apology they must offer the world for existing so intensely. And so they give. They give attention, they give patience, they give the last of their energy at the end of an exhausting day to someone who has never once asked, "And how are you really?" They give explanations for behavior that deserves no explanation. They give second chances shaped like open wounds. They give and give and give until one day something inside them does not break. Something inside them closes. And this is where the story the world tells you goes wrong. The world tells you that when the giver finally stops giving, it is a tragedy, a loss, a relationship gone cold, a friend grown distant, a partner who changed. But I want you to understand something far more important, far more true, and far more dangerous to the people who exploited that giving in the first place. When the empath finally goes quiet, it is not collapse. It is judgment. It is the most complete, most devastating, most unanswerable verdict a human soul can render upon another. And no one walks away from that verdict unchanged. Now, let us go slower because this matters, and the things that matter cannot be rushed. I have spent my life studying what lives beneath the visible personality, beneath the mask each of us wears into the daylight world. The mask I have elsewhere called the persona, the face we show, so that the world will find us acceptable, presentable, safe to be near. Beneath that mask lives another figure entirely, a darker one, not evil, do not mistake me, but unlit, unintegrated. The parts of ourselves we were taught very early were unacceptable to show. anger, need, rage at being used, the desire to be chosen first instead of last. We push these things down into a cellar of the psyche, and we call that cellar the shadow. And most people spend their whole lives pretending the cellar does not exist, walking carefully around the trapdoor in the floor of their own house. The empath, the deeply feeling one, the one who absorbs rather than reflects, often has the deepest cellar of all, because from childhood this person's was taught that their feelings were only useful in service of other people's feelings, that their sensitivity was not a self to be protected, but a resource to be extracted. Somewhere very young, a version of this person learned, I am safe when I am useful, I am loved when I am needed, I am worthy when I am giving. And so the shadow of the empath is not cruelty, it is rage. It is a decades-long, carefully buried, utterly silenced rage at being consumed instead of cherished. And here is the part almost no one tells you, that rage does not disappear because it is buried. It transforms. It waits. And when it finally rises, and it always, eventually rises, it does not come up screaming. It comes up as silence, because the empath has spent their entire life mastering the art of not exploding. Their rage learned long ago that it was not permitted the theater of a tantrum. So instead, it learned the theater of departure. This is the mechanism I want you to understand tonight, because once you understand it, you will never again be confused by your own quiet, or frightened of it, or ashamed of it. The quiet exit is not the absence of feeling. It is feeling that has finally, after years of drowning, found the only shore it was ever allowed to walk toward. Consider for a moment the ones who did the using. They built their peace on your permanence. They did not think of you as a person with a limit. They thought of you as a landscape, always there, always fertile, always able to be planted in again, no matter how many seasons had already been harvested from your soil. This is the quiet cruelty of taking someone's endless patience for granted. It teaches the taker that patience is not a gift being offered, but a resource being mined, infinite, free, requiring no gratitude because it requires no cost. They never once asked what it cost you to keep forgiving them. They never once wondered what it cost you to keep explaining their behavior to yourself in ways that made it bearable. They assumed the well would never run dry because you never once let them see it running low. And so when you finally go quiet, when you finally stop initiating the conversation, stop chasing the explanation, stop offering the fourth and fifth and sixth chance, it does something to their inner world that no argument ever could. An argument gives them something to fight. An argument gives them a villain to resent, a wound to nurse, a story in which they are the misunderstood one. But silence gives them nothing to hold on to. Silence takes away the stage entirely. There is no scene to perform contrition in because you are not there to witness the performance. There is no wound to point to because you never named one. There is only the sudden, vertiginous absence of a thing they had built their whole comfort around, and the horrifying awareness that they cannot even locate the moment they lost it. This is what I mean when I say the quiet exit is not the empath losing. It is the only form of justice available to someone who was never taught that they were allowed to be angry out loud. It is a judgment so complete it does not require a jury, because the verdict is simply, I am no longer available to be used. And there is no appeal against a door that closes without a sound. I want to speak now about something the ordinary understanding of revenge gets entirely wrong. And I want you to listen closely, because this is where a shift will happen inside you, if you let it. Revenge, in the common imagination, is loud. It wants an audience. It wants the other person to suffer visibly, publicly, in proportion to the suffering they caused. But this is a young form of justice, a wound, still speaking the language of the wound. True psychological reckoning does not need an audience, because true psychological reckoning is not interested in the other person's suffering. It is interested in your own return to yourself. The quiet exit devastates, not because it is designed to devastate. That is the crucial distinction the wounded ego cannot understand, but because it is designed to save the one leaving. It is not an act performed at the other. It is an act performed for the self, and its brutality is a side effect, not a strategy. And this is precisely why it cannot be defended against, cannot be argued with, cannot be manipulated back into reopening. You cannot charm your way past a door that was never closed out of spite. You can only stand outside it in the new and unfamiliar cold, and finally feel what it is like to be the one left waiting. Do you understand what I am telling you? The most devastating thing a person can do to someone who exploited their goodness is not to hate them. It is to stop needing anything from them at all, including their apology, including their understanding, including their acknowledgement of the harm. The moment your peace no longer requires their remorse, you have left a room they cannot follow you into, because they do not have the map. They were never given the coordinates of your inner world. You never showed them, because for years you were too busy managing theirs. Let me tell you a truth about giving that almost no one says aloud, because it sounds, at first, ungenerous. Endless giving is not always love. Sometimes it is fear wearing love's clothing, fear of being abandoned if you stop being useful, fear of being unlovable if you are not indispensable, fear that your worth is conditional on your output, and so you keep producing and producing and producing, long after the audience has stopped applauding, long after the audience has stopped even watching, because some deep unlit corner of you believes that if you ever stop giving, you will discover that you were never loved for yourself at all, only for what you provided. This is the wound beneath the gift, and it is a wound worth naming, because you cannot heal what you refuse to look at directly. The empath's exhaustion is rarely only about the people who took too much. It is about the moment, long ago, when giving first became the price of belonging. Perhaps it was a parent who only noticed you when you were being helpful. Perhaps it was a household where your own needs were treated as inconvenient, so you learned to erase them before anyone else could reject them. Perhaps it was simply the accumulated weight of 1,000 small moments where you learned that being needed felt safer than being wanted, because being wanted required someone else's free choice, and free choices can always be withdrawn. Whatever the origin, the pattern is the same. You built your sense of worth on a foundation that required constant renovation, constant labor, constant proof. And the people who benefited from that labor rarely wondered whether the foundation was sound. They only wondered whether the house would keep standing long enough for them to keep living in it rent-free. But here is where the story turns, and I want you to feel this turning, not merely understand it. The quiet exit is not only judgment upon them, it is also, and perhaps primarily, the first act of loyalty you have ever shown yourself. It is the moment the frightened child inside you, who learned that love must be earned through exhaustion, finally hears a different voice, an older, quieter, more authoritative voice say, enough. Not enough as punishment, enough as truth, enough the way a body says, enough when it has carried a weight for miles that was never its own to carry. This is what I call, elsewhere and in other language, the return to the center, the slow, often unconscious pull of the psyche back toward its own wholeness after years of being scattered across other people's needs. It is not selfishness. Selfishness takes from others to feed itself. This is something else entirely. It is the refusal to keep starving yourself, to feed people who were never grateful for the meal. And I want to be very precise here, because precision matters in matters of the soul. Your silence is not cruelty. Cruelty requires the intention to cause pain as its primary aim. Your silence has no such aim. Its aim is your own survival. That the other person experiences your survival as devastating tells you everything about how much of your suffering they had come to depend on, and nothing at all about the morality of your choice to stop suffering. Now I want to speak about power, because this is where most people misunderstand themselves most profoundly. We are taught, almost from birth, to associate power with volume. The one who shouts is powerful. The one who threatens is powerful. The one who makes scenes, who makes demands, who makes others flinch. This is our cultural image of strength. And so the quiet ones, the absorbing ones, the ones who feel everything and say almost nothing are mistaken by others, and worse, by themselves, for the powerless ones, the pushover, the doormat, the one who will always come back. But consider for a moment what actually frightens a person who has spent years taking more than they gave. It is not your anger. Anger they can manage. Anger gives them a role to play, the wounded party, the misunderstood one, the one who didn't mean it that way. What actually terrifies such a person, at a level so deep they may never consciously name it, is your indifference. your capacity to simply continue existing fully, vividly, without them. Because your anger tells them they still matter to you. Your silence tells them they no longer do. And there is no wound quite so unbearable to the taker as discovering their own irrelevance. This is the power the quiet ones have always carried and rarely recognized in themselves. The power of withdrawal without explanation. Not withdrawal as punishment, but withdrawal as the simple, undramatic redirection of a life back toward its own center. It requires no permission. It requires no audience. It requires no victory lap. It only requires the willingness to stop performing availability for people who never once asked whether availability was costing you something. I want to say something now about the fear that keeps so many people from ever reaching this quiet exit at all, because naming the fear is often the first step toward moving through it. The fear is this: if I stop giving, I will discover that there was nothing else to me, that my worth was entirely contained in my usefulness, and once the usefulness stops, so does the love, so does the connection, so does the relationship itself, proving finally the old and terrible suspicion that I was never truly wanted, only ever needed. This fear is powerful because it is old, and old fears speak with the voice of certainty, even when they are wrong. But I want you to notice something. The very fact that this fear exists in you is proof that you already suspect the relationship was built on your utility rather than your being. And if that suspicion is correct, if the connection genuinely does collapse the moment you stop supplying it, then the collapse is not evidence of your worthlessness. It is evidence of the relationship's poverty. A bond that cannot survive your rest was never a bond. It was an arrangement dressed in the language of intimacy in which one party mistook the other's exhaustion for eternal availability. Let it collapse, then. Let it collapse and grieve it if you must. Grief is not weakness. Grief is simply love with nowhere left to go. But do not mistake its collapse for your failure. A structure built entirely on your labor was never going to remain standing once your labor stopped. That is not a tragedy. That is architecture revealing its true foundation. There is an old, recurring pattern in the deep stories of every culture, stories older than any single person, patterns that seem to rise again and again out of the shared imagination of humanity, as though they are not invented but remembered. And one of the oldest of these patterns is this: the one who gives too freely, without limit, without discernment, is eventually devoured by what they feed. The well that never says no eventually runs dry, not because giving is wrong, but because giving without boundary is not generosity. It is a slow disappearance disguised as virtue. And in nearly every one of these old stories, the turning point, the moment the story shifts from tragedy toward wholeness, is not a great battle, it is a departure. The one who was consumed simply walks into the forest, or closes the gate, or stops answering the call, and it is only in that departure, that withdrawal into their own unclaimed depths, that they find whatever it was they had been giving away to everyone except themselves. I tell you this not as decoration but as evidence. This pattern is not new, and it is not weakness, and it is not something invented by the modern, wounded mind to excuse cruelty. It is one of the oldest recognitions our species has ever made about the psyche, that a person cannot keep pouring themselves into others indefinitely without eventually needing to pour themselves back into their own cup. The myths knew this before psychology had language for it. Perhaps you have always known it too, somewhere beneath the noise of your daily obligations, and simply needed permission to remember. Let me speak now directly to the part of you that is afraid this quiet exit makes you cold. It does not. Coldness is the absence of feeling. What you are describing, what you have lived, is the opposite. It is the presence of so much feeling, for so long, unmet and unreciprocated, that the system finally had to protect itself from its own depth. This is not the same as stopping caring. This is what caring looks like after it has been exploited past the point of sustainability. The frozen lake is not proof that the water beneath it forgot how to move. It is proof that the water needed, for a season, to stop being disturbed from above. And I want to say clearly, you are allowed to thaw again on your own terms. For people who have earned the privilege of your warmth through their conduct rather than assumed it as their entitlement through your habit. The quiet exit is not a permanent winter. It is a boundary around a wound so that healing becomes possible. Some people, having witnessed your withdrawal and having done the difficult work of genuine change, may eventually be let back in, not because you owe them return, but because you choose it freely, from strength rather than fear. Others will remain outside forever, and that too is not cruelty. That is wisdom finally being permitted to speak after years of being silenced by guilt. I want to address too the grief that so often accompanies this kind of departure, because I do not want you to think that strength and grief are opposites. They are not. The most powerful psychological acts a person can perform are almost always accompanied by grief, because growth nearly always requires the death of something, an illusion, an identity, a hope we had quietly nursed, that things would eventually become what we needed them to be. When you go quiet on someone who exploited you, you are not only leaving them, you are also leaving behind the version of yourself who believed that if you just gave enough, explained enough, forgave enough, they would finally see you, truly see you, and change. That hope dies in the quiet exit, and you are allowed to mourn it. You are allowed to feel the ache of releasing a dream you held on to far longer than the evidence supported. This grief does not undo your strength, it completes it. A person who feels nothing when they finally let go was never really holding on in the first place. Your grief is proof of how much love you were capable of giving. It simply confirms, painfully, that it was given to the wrong address. Now let me speak of what comes after, because this is the part almost no one describes to you in advance. And so you arrive at it disoriented, wondering why victory feels, at first, so much like loss. In the beginning, the silence will feel enormous. You will reach instinctively for the old patterns, the urge to check on them, to soften the blow, to explain yourself one more time so they do not misunderstand your absence as cruelty. Resist this urge, not out of spite, but out of respect for what you are building. Every time you interrupt your own quiet to manage someone else's comfort with it, you are handing back the very energy you just reclaimed. Then, slowly, something else begins to happen. The space that used to be filled with their needs, their moods, their unspoken expectations begins to fill instead with something you had almost forgotten, your own voice, quiet at first, unsure of itself because it has been drowned out for so long by the noise of other people's demands, but present, and with time that voice grows steadier because it is no longer competing with anyone else's for the small allotment of energy you have left at the end of each day. This is what I mean by the return to wholeness, not a dramatic transformation, not a lightning bolt of enlightenment, but the slow, patient reassembly of a self that had been distributed piece by piece into the keeping of people who never once asked whether you could afford the loan. You begin to notice your own preferences again. You begin to notice your own exhaustion before it becomes collapse. You begin, astonishingly, to feel guilty for resting and then gradually to rest anyway because you have finally understood that guilt was never evidence of wrongdoing. It was only the old conditioning protesting its own obsolescence. I want to leave you with something that is not comfort, exactly, but is truer than comfort, and in the end more useful. You were never required to make yourselves smaller so that others could feel large beside you. You were never required to absorb what others refused to carry themselves. You were never required to explain your worth to people who had already decided, long before you opened your mouth, that your worth was measured only in what you could provide them. None of this was ever the price of being loved. It was only ever the price certain people charged you for the privilege of their continued presence. And it was never a fair price, because it was never a price they were willing to pay themselves. The quiet exit, then, is not revenge in the way the wounded ego understands revenge. Not a blow struck to make another person bleed. It is something far older and far more serious. It is the psyche's own justice, arriving without a verdict read aloud, without a sentence pronounced, without even the satisfaction of being witnessed by the one who caused the harm. It is simply the truth, finally permitted to walk out the door it had been standing in front of for years, waiting for someone to say it could leave. And here is the final thing I want you to carry with you tonight, because it is the thing most easily forgotten in the exhaustion of all this. The goal was never to make them suffer. The goal was to stop suffering yourself. If, in the process of reclaiming your own life, Someone who exploited your goodness is left standing in a silence they cannot understand, wondering what they did wrong, searching for a wound to point to and finding none. That is not your revenge. That is simply what it looks like from the outside. When a person finally chooses themselves, let them wonder. Let them search the silence for meaning they will never find, because the meaning was never meant for them. It was always meant for you. It was always, from the very beginning, only ever meant for you. Go quietly then, if quiet is what your soul requires. Go without the explanation you no longer owe. Go without the apology you have been waiting years to receive and may never receive at all. Go and let the going be enough. Let it be complete in itself, needing no applause, no confirmation, no final word from the one you are leaving behind. Because the door that closes without a sound is still and will always be a door that is closed. And on the other side of it, quietly, patiently, finally is you, waiting for yourself, ready at last to come home.